Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Friday, March the 24th, 2023, talking about the parable of the talents. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of the risk involved. You probably heard the phrase carpe diem, seize the day, make the most of every opportunity, basically. Seize the day. Notice that the phrase is not with utmost care and caution, after you've worked out the cost-benefit analysis and determined that there's no logical reason why all systems should not be go, and have assured yourself that the risk is zero, or as close to zero as is theoretically possible, slowly and timidly reach for the day, keeping eyes peeled at every moment for other factors which would render that decision less logical than previously expected and mitigate a sudden and calculated pullback from the day-seizing operation. Mark Bruner talked about only a risk away. He said, used to be that life was a matter of this I will risk, but this I will not. Risk was something that was weighed on a daily basis. It was part of life. You picked one thing over another because you had weighed the risk and come to a conclusion that one risk was more palatable than another. For example, as farmers traditionally have walked a risk-filled path in that daily that they had to weigh whether this day or that day would be better one to, for instance, disc the field, because the weather was something out of their control, and all that they had was their folk prognostication and intuition for predicting rain or sun. Farming, therefore, had traditionally been a pretty risky business. Sometimes you decided correctly, and others you didn't. It was a matter of risk and faith, and most farmers were attuned to that because that was the only choice they had. That is, of course, until the advent of modern weather forecasting. Today, risk is far less of a factor in farming. The person we once knew was the weather-beaten, feisty guy in the bib jeans who kibitz down at the mill each morning, speculating on whether the skies would be dark by noon or not, is rapidly becoming an image of the past. Although we live in a society that is no less risky than in the past, we live in a governing system that has made its job to secure us from as much of it as possible. Seatbelts, helmets, Social Security, even weather forecasters who tell us to go down to our basements just because the conditions are right for a tornado. With all this help, it seems we are rapidly becoming obsessed with living safely over living faithfully. This is filled by the name of Mark Bruner, by the way. He says, I recently read where a bowler who was one pin away from bowling a perfect game and just couldn't bring himself to play the final ball. Instead, he silently packed his shoes and ball and walked out and never again set foot in a bowling alley. Does God want us to take risks, he asks? Certainly. Not foolhardy ones. And yet when he presents us with situations that require thoughtful deliberation and a faith-filled heart, he isn't expecting us to back down because there might be risk involved. God once told a soldier named Gideon to confront the risks and pull down the pagan altars in his land, and despite the risk that others would be offended, even moved to attack them, Gideon faithfully obeyed. When God puts us into pressure-filled situations, we always have a choice. We can pray for strength and take the risks that he's put before us, or we can weigh the risks and decide to walk away. If we walk away, he says, we may never know the perfection that God has reserved for us. Our 300 game may only be a risk away. Teddy Roosevelt once talked about risk. He said, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again because there's no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself for a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat. Taking risk. John Henry Jowett, influential British pastor and preacher of the late 19th century, early 20th century, once said, "Ministry that costs nothing accomplishes nothing." And Martin Luther once said, "A religion that does nothing, that saves nothing, that gives nothing, that costs nothing, that suffers nothing, is worth nothing." I think what we don't often see in the parable of the talents is that there was risk involved. And it was because of the possibility of risk that that third slave said, "Oh, I don't want to risk losing my master's money, so I'm going to bury it in the ground, at least give him his money back when he returns." And of course, as it ends up, that wasn't the right choice to make. I want to say a little bit more about risk-taking and wrap this all up tomorrow. Until then, take care. Bye.